Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, a.k.a. UberBear, and I'm joined tonight by a special guest host.
It's me, Myagic.
Welcome, Myagic. Welcome to the show. It's if you guys don't recall, we actually had a great time discussing the Fey Cube on a previous episode, and if you haven't checked out that episode, please check that out. Please check out that cube. We will have that in the show notes, along with all of May's amazing cube journeys. I mean, spectacular curation will make you totally redefine what you believe is the ceiling and a floor of a cube. Would you agree with that, May?
Sure. We'll go with that.
New ceilings, new floors, total reconstruction of cube theory. Make goblins great again. The whole faction will come to life.
I mean, that's just the nature of trying to build a low power cube.
And in that previous episode, we talked about how changelings are changeling glue. I mean, they are the glue, the tie that binds. Yeah, they are. They are, in fact. You made me rethink that. I'm looking at that in my horror genre cube. But this is not what we're talking about during this episode, is it, May? What are we talking about?
Today, I really wanted to talk about bad problem that happens within the cube community and Magic as kind of a whole, is that players and curators tend to over-tinker their cubes. They tend to over-tinker their decks. And I think it is a problem. I know that I'm guilty of it. I'm sure you're guilty of it. I think that deep down, if we're all honest with each other, we're kind of over-tinkering our things, and I think we need to reevaluate that.
So we're going to break it down, but before we go too deep into this subject, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. We'll start out with May, since she's our special guest. What do you have in this?
I made a type of whiskey sour. It's kind of disappointing, but can't go wrong with some Jim Beam and some lemonade.
I'm going extremely out of my comfort zone, and I may have actually mistakenly grabbed this drink. It is a St. Benedict's breakfast, coffee and oatmeal double, which sounds like I'm drinking a milkshake with a beer. It's a Belgian-style dark ale.
I'd drink it.
I'm going to crack this open, and I may be grabbing another beer here shortly. All right, so let's get to our topic. So as we alluded to just a moment ago, May was speaking about, we're going to call this one upgrades or over-tinkering. And we do realize these two ideas can meld together. I mean, it could either be an artistic display or a way that you, I guess, get rid of your bad day at work, or it could possibly be, I got a new set that came out, or maybe it could be, oh man, I got some feedback and they said, why are you running this card? And they gave you like some real intel as to why you chose to place this inside of your environment, or perhaps you should not have it in your environment, that it's either a detriment or that it's adding or should be added to the environment. May, do you have anything to add to that idea before I start going down this path?
Absolutely. I think that when it comes to over-tinkering, I think one of the major causes behind that is that we tend to get new changes in information, new changes in data, and it is easy for us to overcorrect the issue by being like, okay, this did not perform well this last session, so let's just go ahead and spend the next couple hours figuring out how I'm going to fix it, instead of realizing the game naturally has variation, and sometimes you just gotta let it settle.
Yeah, so we're not using we're not using an actual model or any kind of scientific data or analytics or any of the above, but rather we're using Christian sitting to the left of me said, why are you running werewolves in this cube? I don't think they're very good. Next thing you know, you're going home, you're feeling emotional, and you go, I'll teach them and I'm going to add more werewolves, or I'm going to remove all the werewolves from my cube. And I know that's an extreme circumstance, but that's how this can play out. Would you agree, May?
No, that's absolutely how it is, where what ended up happening with, like, say, knights in my environment, where it got mentioned several times to me over the span of my cube's lifespan of, why are there knights in here? I would much rather this be a warrior. Why can't you just be a warrior? And I was like, all right, I heard you.
So one thing you have to learn is, and we talked about this on a previous episode, and we've got a script and we have a nice little layout for this, but this was meant to be kind of a meta conversation where we've got curator conversation. But what you do get is you have to learn how to process feedback as a curator and take it within context, because oftentimes perhaps you have a vision for your cube, you have a theme, and I'll use an example. And this is something that May and I actually discussed amongst ourselves during our previous episode, and I have previously apologized. It was for, what was your ultimatum you were on? Was it Cruel Ultimatum?
That card got cut.
Yeah, Yeah, but it cost like it was like three
Uncastable.
black pips, two blue pips. But you know what? It wasn't, because I'll redact that statement, because I said it was uncastable. But then later, after Christian, our good friend here, was so enamored with your cube design that he cloned and built it himself. We later that week went to a local brewery, and I cast it like 3 times in one
Nice.
game, because because I wasn't taking into context the speed of your environment. I was taking it from, say, I was combining my EDH brain from what I know about that particular card, and I was also combining it with my environments tend to be a little bit faster, whereas yours is probably about 2 turns on a different clock than mine. And I wasn't taking into account that the card that I said at the time, my feedback was, this is grossly uncastable. And I do appreciate that you said that, and Stu did fortify my stance. But then I have to give you the feedback that later down the road, I did in fact cast that multiple times, cast it comfortably. And if anything, strangely enough, it was actually too powerful.
Wow.
Because the effect that it did laid waste to my opponents. They were a little mad, actually. It caused salt. So I'll tell you that removing it based on salt is perfectly acceptable.
Good thing it got removed anyways.
Castable than yeah, but I apologize. You put Grixis Charm in there instead.
I had Croesus Charm in there for a bit, but I ended up...
Croesus Charm.
Yeah, I ended up cutting it because the 3 colors just kind of were no longer cutting the mustard, as you like to say.
Yeah, so it's the understanding how to process feedback as a curator, and also kind of coaching or teaching your players, to giving them a background or giving them a story, or trying to give them story elements as to what kind of story are you trying to tell in your environment. So you're in your Fey Cube. If I had to ask you right now to go 40,000 feet in the air and give me a synopsis of the story you're trying to tell, so that what I should expect as a player, how would you describe it?
It's a very slow, it's a very subtype matters cube that cares a lot about flavor and a lot of the planes like Lorwyn and, by proxy Shadowmoor, Eldraine, and whatnot. And a lot of those themes are based around flavor and Vorthos reasonings rather than just straightforward performance reasonings. But I think that the main identity of the cube is that it is subtype themes with a lot of other adjacent sub-themes that are fun, dynamic for both new players and for established players.
You will hear May and I use both the term subtype and factions. We'll be using that instead of a word that we both agreed that we feel has grown to have a negative connotation, and that would be the word tribal, that we are now deciding as a group that we're going to move past, and we're going to do a replacement with that. So as you hear these terms, we're going to refer to the groups as their subtype and or the factions. And I'm sure there's other synonyms that we can put into place. But if you feel free to educate yourself on the internet, on the story of why we're choosing to no longer use that word, it'll make more sense. But that's a little anecdote that I felt necessary to throw in there, because we may be speaking along those lines often. May, do you have anything to add to that subject before we move on?
If the subject comes up, I'll make sure to notate that it is the card subtype rather than just, the connotation of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We're choosing to take the higher road on this particular subject. It was something that I recently educated myself on, and I have to admit that I learned. I'm getting older, and I do learn. That's what we should always do.
What? You mean old dogs can learn new tricks? Crazy.
Yeah, I am a 45-year-old dog, so if you multiply times 7, I'm in multiple dog centuries at this point. So
Barks and dust.
Let's talk about you have now received this feedback. So I gave you the feedback. So we gave you what I thought was valid feedback at the time, and then you made a correction in your cube based on our discussion. We all agreed that maybe the pips that were involved in casting Cruel Ultimatum perhaps was overbearing, and so that you had to make some adjustments. And I feel like that was more of an analytical stance, and we discussed it as a group. Whereas it wasn't like an emotional response from cubing on a Friday night, and you did not see, say, the werewolf faction play to its best ability, so you've now decided, well, I got to go home and either add more werewolves or remove more werewolves and try to balance the scales. And what we're kind of moving on to in that particular subject is when you're trying to balance your cube. I will add that all cubes, unless you're locking it, unless you're time vaulting your cube, you're trapping it and saying, all right, it will not move past Lorwyn. This is the block. I will not add anything else. Sure. But otherwise, all of my cubes are living cubes. May, would you speak to that?
My cube's absolutely living. It's constantly getting updates, but because my cube has gotten a following online, surprisingly, how did I get here? But because I have a following, it kind of keeps me honest, because I can't just willy-nilly throw in updates anymore.
Correct. So as we do that too, as you get visibility, some of mine have gotten a number of, like for instance, a good thing that happened to me recently was we went to CubeCon. UberBear's Artifact Cube was featured, and they forced us to lock it. Now that made me pause for a week and stare, and I was chomping at the bit, like literally salivating like Pavlov's dog, wanting to get in that cube and make changes. But I'm like, no, they will not allow it. All right, fine. And the minute I got back, I got all this really great. It actually was a good thing. It allowed me to pause, breathe, take the cube as is. It made me panic up until that moment because Despite the matter, I was going to put my cube in the hands of, at the time, almost 200 players, at least let them see it, right? And then it also was featured on the internet. And that could be a kind of a frightening thing a little bit. So I was trying to get it as tuned as possible, and that I knew that I'd get feedback. And we're going to talk about some of that feedback I received shortly. But when I came back, I made some changes, and that's where we're kind of talking about the tipping of the scales, or over adding or subtracting from your cube to try to balance either a faction or a subtype or just an archetype in general by adding and subtracting too much. And one of the things that will cause that more frequently than not is the shiny new toys. Wizards of the Coast, and while I am appreciative of the every 2.5, 3 months of a brand new set, as I said, myself and May, it's frankly overwhelming, probably for my personality and yours too, because I like the shiny new toys, the squeaky new things, but I'm starting to be more, I want to say I'm being more mature in my decision making. At one point it would be like, you got a new set and it comes out with, what does it come out, like 230 cards, give or take, or 180? It doesn't matter. I would say, well, there's 30 cards going to go in here just because they've got vampires in there. Now I've kind of said, well, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. I'm going to add a few of them, but not all of them, to try to unbalance it. I don't want to add too many of the different factions to tilt the scales on the performance of the cube by doing it erratically. Right. So, which moves over to our next suggestion. So when when a new set comes out, you can order 15, 20 cards that seem like they may be interested in your cube without the intent of actually putting them in your cube. I've done that often, especially if they're affordable foils and whatnot, or they're cheap or 15-cent cards, and I'm all about it. Doesn't mean they have to go in, and then I can have them in a binder on standby. If I find out this card didn't perform to my expectations, then I can trade it out with another card and test them, so that I'm not doing a mass.
So believe it or not,
an unbalanced.
I actually do have a solution that I have started implementing for my fake cube. I haven't really done it as much for my other cubes because I haven't been needing to update them as frequently, but when it comes to the shiny new toys, it's easy to be like, oh, I want to try this in my environment. And instead of immediately just going to throw it in a shipping order and just going to send it and I'm going to test it and it's going to be great. Instead, what I'm wanting to do is I will pull up my maybe board on CubeCobra, slap it into the list, and then I'm just going to mull over it for like the next couple weeks or so that way I can kind of get used to the environment, get used to like whenever our next play session is with my pod, and then feel like, okay, is this something that I want in this current play space, rather than just immediately being like, send it, bring it to me, throw it in.
Yes, that's brilliant. Actually, that's pretty brilliant. I'll be honest with you, I've never used that function. I'll have to look at that. What I'll do is actually, when I build out the show notes for this, I'll look that up the maybe board and I'll get some screen captures so that people can direct themselves. That's an amazing idea, actually. I like that very much. Yeah, I'm down.
I have a list of,
I always wonder it sounds dumb, but I wondered what that was for, and I never used that function. So yeah, that's cool. Getting back to so that's kind of the formulaic way of, I order too many cards so that I can kind of trickle down or cascade into the cubes so that I'm not adding so many that I'm throwing off the environment. For example, I have UberBear's Artifact Cube, and at this point now, as I said, this is 360 cards. I have added in, give or takes, 12 to 15 new cards, but I took a long time studying them, and I actually ordered them in waves, which was probably not the smartest shipping method that you could have done, but I did it on purpose because I kept kind of studying to see if I had cards that were, I had received feedback from CubeCon. One would be, for example, Cauldra Complete, which I'm kind of jumping ahead on our script, but this is relevant. was a card that was benchmarked as way too powerful for my environment, and I do agree. I had put it in that particular cube environment under the context of my players, and we don't get to draft with the level of frequency that we did at CubeCon. So I had not had the opportunity to see that many drafts fire and actually see that card do as much damage. And basically, I heard it from all over the room. It wasn't like one player that gave me the feedback. I heard 20, 30 people saying, why are you running this card? Or, hey, I want to say thank you. I just totally crushed my draft. I played Cauldron Complete and won.
Sometimes it feels good to stomp, but other times it feels bad to be stomped.
Yeah, and I should have caught it as an outlier. I think I definitely knew it was an outlier, but I chose to run it anyways. And I was trying to put countermeasures in the cube, like things that said exile and whatnot in there. But at the end of the day, if the card is so powerful, why am I adding so many countermeasures or ways to combat a card because a singular card?
I'm actually going to give you a little bit of pushback here, believe it or not. So Night Pack Ambusher is in my fake cube. And it's one of those cards where at first glance, you're like, this is kind of an outlier. This is a card that can take over the game if it's left unanswered. It's just a 4/4 flash that can make a bunch of wolves. But what people don't realize past first glance is that you have to alter your playstyle around it. It has demands that you have to play around in order to get that benefit. And while, yes, it can take over the game, in this environment, it's already tailored in such a way that if you just throw it in some random green deck, you're not going to get huge benefits past it being a 4/4. But at first glance, it's easy to be like, okay, well, this seems like a big power outlier, but I would have never tried it if I were to create that line in the sand of, no, I'm not going to ever test the waters. So I'm going to push back a little bit.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I do believe in having cards that represent the ceiling and cards that represent the floor. It's unavoidable. I don't want a flat environment, but when new cards come out, I'm always looking for an opportunity to upgrade or change and keep it popping fresh, if you will, for my group. But it does come at the risk of, quote unquote, unbalancing the scales. Or if the cube ran smoothly before and you want to continue to update and refresh it, it is a good idea to benchmark what cards you removed. And Cube Cobra does an amazing job of this in your blog, but basically benchmark or annotate the cards that you removed from your cube and what you replaced it with on what dates, etc. I've recommended in a previous episode putting them in a binder, and it helps you to see if there's any outliers or if you tip the scales on a certain archetype, a subtype that starts taking over the group, or a faction, right, starts overtaking the environment. It's just a good idea to keep your eyes on it. And that's where that feedback comes from. And we talked about this in multiple episodes. It's definitely a social contract, right? You want to play with people who want to play your cube anyway. So, I mean, it's not like they're going to be egregious and make statements, but you do want, when someone offers you advice on your cube and says, why are you running this card? I prefer it to be packaged as a problem solution, if that makes sense, before I start making my cuts and my changes. And if you receive enough of that, I heard an old adage. It was, if someone calls you a horse, then okay, whatever. But if another person calls you a horse and you're like, okay. But if 3 people call you a horse, there's a good chance you might be a horse.
I mean, that's certainly a way to look at it. To loop it back to one of our original notes here, is that one of the reasons that we tend to over-tinker is just because we want people to have a fun experience. We care about our player experience, and when we take a lot of those criticisms or those immediate comments about our cubes and their play experience and whatnot, we want to adjust it so that way they have fun. It's easy to have that emotional reaction.
To calibrate the fun.
Yeah.
Yes. We are always attempting to calibrate the fun for other players when fun is a purely subjective idea system anyways. And I've got all personality types in my group. I don't know if you do, May, but it can make a pretty hard target sometimes.
I definitely have a lot of different types of players that play my cube. So it helps getting a lot of information.
I've got Timmys and Johnnies and Spikes and all these other types that I couldn't even tell you, and it makes it really hard to find their fun level. But then I try to just add and subtract. Now, at the end of the day, I am a firm believer we are the ones that we're the artist. We have the paintbrush. The curator does, right? And the feedback gets processed, but it can be taken out of context to the environment where we're trying to do world development or tell a story with the Fae Cube or with the Horror Cube, or I've got a 180 Munson cube that's based off of Eddie Munson from Stranger Things, the Lord of Metal. So you have to listen to Metallica while you're playing it, and Sepultura, and it's just the environment. So when I'm choosing my cards, it's based on that idea that I'm trying to paint. So then my players will have to kind of have a little bit of acceptance to that is the picture that I'm painting. You're coming into a world that I've made for you. In that case, like a Metallica concert, just picture that, right? So the cards aren't going to be the highest powered. So if you're a Spike and you're wanting to come sit down and spike that draft, if you're looking for something that matches a MTGO or a powered vintage cube, you won't find that in that environment. You're going to find some cards that are strong, yes, ceiling high, yes, but you're not going to find the MTGO in my Munson cube. So I think it's a good idea. And my buddy Christian and I were talking about this recently about briefing your players on the story you're trying to tell, so that when you receive the feedback, you know how to process. They understand the context.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
I mean, I also think that a large part of it is a whole other conversation. We should have another episode at some point is how to satisfy your spikes. Because I recently had a bunch of spikes enter my pod. So...
Yeah, I had that happen at CubeCon, and I was proud. It was different. I mean, I had a lot of people come over and tell me, oh man, I just beat face with Cauldron Complete, or another person walked over to me, and it was pretty awesome. I was in the middle of a match, and they laid out 5 cards, and all I see is KCI, and then I think I see basically some, it was Walking Ballista, and I'm like, oh, okay, I see what you did there. And they were excited, like achievement unlocked, and I'm in the middle of a match, but I'm seeing 5 cards fanned out to make some crazy infinite combo, and I had to go, yeah, man, I did that on purpose. And I was thinking to myself, I didn't really do that.
Yep, totally intentional. I meant to do it. How'd you do that?
Yeah, I did that. Yeah. I'm glad you found it. Good job. But
sure.
It was pretty amazing, actually. Yeah, it was pretty sweet. So you're going to have, when you start adding new cards, or you're adding and tweaking and always trying to target that fun meter of other players, it does make us as curators subject to a slippery slope, right? Add too much, add too little, tilt the scales on the performance of a archetype or a subgroup or a faction starts overtaking your environment. You add one too many spirits, and you never actually know what that point of failure is. You can try all you want, but it's really hard to know what that tipping point is. It only happens when it happens, and it can be, as May mentioned before, it can be in a closed single night, Friday night, and you just see the spirits overrun you, or the goblins overran you. Or that night, changelings were just the most bonkers thing I've ever seen in my life in the Fae Cube, right? But you have to take that within context, which leads me to another idea that I do. I take notes.
Notes are good.
I try to force myself not to go home and want to take out the spirit that, Stu said was way too powerful, overtook him, couldn't deal with it. Rather, I'll make a note. I'll just take a little note, I'll type in my computer, and I'll say, I saw it perform this way on this night. If I see it back, it's back to my horse comment. I saw it once, but if I see it twice, I see it 3 times, it might be a horse. So I try to be more calm, cool, and collected, if you will, cucumber-like.
I think...
So that I'm not doing this emotional
I think to add on top of that, one of the biggest issues is that I think, in general, people do not give enough time for their decks to kind of settle in a bit. And you aren't going to get enough relevant information in 1 or 2 drafts. And it's certainly a different beast since we're enfranchised with the Cube community. We have stuff on CubeCobra. We have people drafting our cubes online. So we get just a constant stream of new data, which changes, what we thought of, oh, I see that a lot of people are ending up passing this up online. But then in person, it ends up getting first or second picked in the pack, just as an example. And I think it's because you have to figure out what the context is, not only for your cube and your environment, but also whether or not that card is a zero-sum game in terms of the experience that it's providing.
Yeah, so another thing that I'll do is if I'm overtaken by a card, if I have an experience, and a lot of times our drafts are abbreviated. Maybe if we get 6 players, we'll do 1v1, maybe 2 rotations, etc. Because some people are taking a little longer than others, and we want to get on some commander that night kind of situation. But what we will do is, if you get completely decimated or beat down by a deck that's got, let's just say, Cauldron Complete in it, and you're using that card, and Christian's telling me this card is too strong, it's too strong, it's too strong. What I'll do is I'll hand him my deck and we'll swap decks to see if I can use the countermeasures within his deck to beat the problem. And I realize that's got some bias to it because the problem has been flagged, but at least I can try to either duplicate the malfunction, if you will. That's my troubleshooting brain talking. Or I can try to see if it's, if there was actually an answer that was being overlooked within the deck. A misunderstanding, right? Or maybe some feedback can happen. So you're not taking just one-sided opinion. You're seeing the other half of the equation. It's just a suggestion that has been helpful.
I think we've been talking a lot about like cuts in terms of making like immediate changes afterwards, but I think that there is also another type of over-tinkering that tends to happen of, hey, this is particularly strong, so I'm going to attempt to buff these other things. And that's what I tend to catch myself in is, oh, hey, this particular archetype is strong. I'm going to try to buff these other archetypes to try to get them to keep up. And then what ends up happening is that initially Golgari mid-range package was kind of the dominant strategy for my cube, and then over time it started balancing out a bit more, and now we're starting to see that kind of balance that I wanted to see of, oh, well, sometimes Rakdos Goblins is going to come up, sometimes the Golgari mid-range is going to come up, sometimes just blue-white mill deck is going to come up, just as an example.
You will, as a curator, a lot of times we'll use my werewolves as an example. I have played multiple games where they've totally killed me, right? I mean, I've been beat to death by werewolves, but they're also very inconsistent in the day, night, and all those things, but they're thematic, and they're beautiful, and they're part of the story that I'm trying to do. And it's just a sacrifice that you choose to make as both a player and a curator when I explain to them that this is my world building. So there's a level, Jason mentioned that in our math episode, or Dr. Brinkley, where he realizes that that's not the best, but he also has a passion for the color green, and he's willing to accept the power downgrade ever so slightly. But then I as a curator, I'm trying to beef them up too much. And so you've got 4 tires on the car, right? But what happens when you start overinflating one tire? You start pulling to the left really hard.
And it's very easy to do.
And that's a good... And it's easy to do through overcompensation, so you have to be mindful of that. So I do recommend, and we talked about this before, using CubeCobra's analytics. It has embedded within it where you can do tables and you can do statistical analysis of your layout. You can see your averages and your standard deviation, which we talked about in our math episode, which is a huge method of seeing basically the differential between your mana values and how much your spread is between your mana values, to make sure that you're not, because I know it's just about not just about the power level of the card, but the math also plays as a huge part in your decision making, and that's what can tip your scales on your cube environment as well. Too many pips.
Exactly.
Any thoughts on that?
I tend to be more of a follower of fun rather than just strictly math, where I'm more likely to track, okay, this particular deck had this amount of feel goods both playing and playing against, or this particular deck had a certain interaction. So, for example, I'm going to use my fake cube again, because it's just consistent and easy. But Mill, just as a flat example, is an archetype that I support in my cube. And when it comes to Mill, there's a few different issues that can come together with it, of sometimes the deck doesn't come together. Sometimes it's just not very consistent. Sometimes one player just gets completely blown out because they drew Fracture Sanity and then just a bunch of other miscellaneous Mill cards and completely blew somebody out of the game. And part of that... Yeah,
I have a comment about that too, because at CubeCon I actually got to play your Mill deck. And I had 1 card left and they had 1 life, and I was able to get the 1 life before they got my 1 card. Yay. It was awesome. We were both sweating. Stu's like wanting to record it live because we're sitting there and he almost got me. He almost got me.
You know how with Mark Rosewater's Drive to Works, he had one where he was talking about, what was it? Standard case? Whatever the term was that he used that describes basically whatever the majority case is and not the corner cases.
Okay, that makes
And
sense, yeah.
the majority
what
case
happens most
of
often, I suppose.
Mill creates a fun deck. It is fun to play around and interact with because it creates an interesting clock and an interesting dynamic for both sides of the table. Mill has to really fight to get those extra few cards milled out in order to win the game. And from the other side, then they realize this deck is existing in an opposite axis of me, so I have to try to get my way around their control cards. And I have to understand that sometimes, because it's zero sum, sometimes it is going to be a blowout, sometimes it's just not going to do anything, but a majority of those games are somewhere in between, where it's very tooth to nail fighting of Mills trying to get out that last single card while you're trying to get them out of their last life point.
Yeah, so that brings kind of when you're receiving that feedback on that scenario with life versus mill, you can see where, I guess it depends on what side of the fence you stand with the emotional response to the archetype or the play style of milling, right? And so you have to take that within context. And one of the things that I have on here as notes is maybe they'll say, this archetype sucks, right? Well, then you have to be able to accept whenever I ask you why. Like, why, May? Why would you say that? May? Why? And I want you to be able to give me a legitimate counterpoint, right? And if you can convince me of that, maybe I'm willing to accept that maybe Mill isn't that great, right? But that feedback chain has to be a lot more cordial than
exactly.
It needs to be something consistent. So problem solution based observations will stop curators from over tinkering and throwing off these cube environments that we love so much. Think of us as delicate creatures, right? And we're artists. We're all artists. And we're being told that our work it didn't cut the mustard this time around, right? So what do? We get more mustard. That's what curators do.
We get more mustard. Bring in the tub.
We get more mustard. Yeah, get in the tub of mustard. So it's just a social contract that needs to happen. Power outliers is one of the notes I had, and we kind of talked about that. There's a healthy amount of power outliers, and your ceiling and floor is going to change drastically based on your cube.
It absolutely depends on your cube goals, and part of that is understanding, is this part of my cube goal of this card is supposed to be a power outliner? For example, what was that stupid wolf that I added for a while? It was like Hollowhenge Overseer, I think? No, Hollowhenge something. It was that big dumb wolf that makes wolves every upkeep. Yeah, it's a fantastic card. But
it was definitely
it was absolutely a power outlier, but I was willing to test it, and I over-tinkered because I was like, how far can I push wolves? So I sat down, and I was like, okay, I'm aware that I'm over-tinkering it. I'm aware that I'm overextending what wolves are supposed to be doing, but I want to see how far I can push wolves before somebody finally starts being like, hey, wolves kind of have stupid cards. Maybe we should deal with this.
So then I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to have you ask me the same question when we're done. So I'm going to start with this. May, when is it appropriate to upgrade or modify your cube?
That's a great question. I think that it is appropriate to modify when you've had enough feedback. Like you said, after like a few times of being called a horse, you're probably a horse. And sometimes keeping majority case in mind of majority of cases are going to look like this. This is kind of an outlier case of, hey, this card happened to take over this game. Oops.
Now I'll ask you to ask me the same question if you will, please.
Now, the question for you is, how do you prepare a dragon egg? No, I'm kidding. Nice little callback to the previous.
Yeah, a little salt, a little butter, over easy preferably. I like to do the Man of the Woods cooking style, so I need a nice bubbling creek. I'm going to need it's got to be cast iron, right? I've got to get it to approximately 600 degrees. Just a light oil, and then drop it in the bubbling of the creek.
When do you think is the appropriate amount of time to be editing your cube?
I would say I like to overview before I go into a draft based on my previous draft. I don't know why I do that. It's a little lazy, meaning like the last time I played, I may have received some feedback that I've kind of read about, or I've read some blogs, or I've looked at other curators' cubes, and I've listened to podcasts since. So the UberCubeMTGPodCast I heard is really great. And then I'll get feedback on kind of, maybe this card is a power outlier, et cetera, and then I'll make the decision to migrate it probably 35 minutes before our next draft. It's a bad habit that I have. For instance, Christian's coming over tonight. night. I knew that I had benchmarked about 4 cards in my horror cube from CubeCon that needed to get swapped out because I had received feedback on that cube as well. Totally forgot about it. Knew Christian's coming up tonight. Wanted to draft it, see how they're doing, and I said, oh man. And I started just going through my binder and swapping them out. So I can't say that there was a real strong pattern of...
So I actually have a suggestion for you. Put a post-it on wherever your cube container is, and have it where on top of the cards to say, play the cards first. Something to remind you to not just immediately switch before it happens. So that way you can actually sit down, play the cards again, and then see if you still have the same feeling. Give it a second run. So you can't be told a second time if you're not passing the same people.
It was. I failed my own test. The next one that we have written up here, and I'm going to direct this one for you, May. I have some thoughts on this one, and it was discussing the power of the pack one, pick one. Yep. So I've heard various. There's a lot of thoughts on this. There's the thought that it has value. The other one thought there's the thoughts that it's just showcasing. There's other thoughts that that it has that new players can learn from it because they can see what others can choose. There's all these different stories, right? People have different opinions about the idea of a pack one, pick one, and whether or not it has any value. I have my thoughts, but I want to get yours first. As far as making choices.
I am in the boat that in terms of making choices for a pack one, pick one, I don't think that it is important for the overall draft, but it is important for dissecting the overall themes, identity, and whatnot of the cube. And when you have a well-balanced cube, it's able to convey whatever its themes are trying to do within 15 randomized cards. If that makes sense.
Yes, and I would yeah, and I'll add to that, and I'll say that if I see a card that gets 2 picked, and I keep seeing the word slamma-jamma over and over again, right? And let's use Soul Ring, which I know is
I have a better outlier. Once upon a time. Because that one's actually relevant in my environment.
Yeah. In context to your environment. But let's do one that's just more egregious. Let's just start with Soul Ring. And what I mean by that is it's an eyesore. And I'm going to put that in a pauper cube, just to be let's be dumb right now. Okay, let's just follow me on this journey. And if people keep saying slamma-jamma on the Soul Ring, it should really be screaming to you that multiple players from multiple groups strongly believe that this card is the best card in this entire pack, but the context of the pack has changed over and over again, but they keep pointing out this extreme outlier. And I know that's a absurd idea that is made there, but that's where pack one, pick ones, if you distill it down to you want to find out, like if you're running a card, we'll use the adventure cards you were just talking about a minute ago, and it keeps getting picked over and over again by multiple players, is there slamma-jamma, and I don't know why that term keeps coming up all the time, but it does, or grab that really fast, or you're not going to see that wheel. It is an indicator of a power level of a card, and I do think that it benchmarks it that maybe people are starting to notice this is too strong in context of this environment. Do you agree with that statement?
Context matters. That's what I have to say about it.
Context does matter. Yeah. So another note that I've put as far as this is thematic cubes are more subject to this unbalancing. And when I say, and I'll even add like pauper cubes and peasant cubes and all those, they're, in my opinion, they're easier to unravel and unbalance the storytelling by putting powerful cards in there, especially thematic-based cubes, like the Fey cube. If I put a card in there, it's just super, and I know it's just one card out of 385 or whatever it is. I do realize that. But if you start using that, it's okay to keep adding cards to that power level. It's going to change the entire identity of the cube. Whereas in the Power Vintage Cube online, the MTGO,
right.
They change cards like nobody's business, and I understand why they do. And you can see huge
money,
power
baby.
swings in that cube. Yeah, they'll keep swinging back and forth, and it makes sense. But it also doesn't get the scales on that cube doesn't tilt so heavily. Whereas, like maybe people identify the white weenie deck within that cube's hyper powerful, or aggro is very powerful within that cube. It's also easy compatible. Whereas in a thematic cube environment, if you start making too many changes and offsetting it too much, you can really throw off that balance of that cube pretty quickly. Would you?
So I think it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. I think that the bar is set significantly higher for MTGO's cube. And when you have things like these pauper cubes, these thematic cubes, flavor cubes, whatnot, where you have a pile of this is a specific goal that the curator has in mind, of a bunch of low power cards, and then just this random power outlier, say Soul Ring, just thrown in, just willy-nilly, then it can warp the environment for whoever ends up with that card. However, because most cubes run about 360 up, it tends to balance itself out by proxy for everybody else.
Yes, I would agree with that. So if I were going to throw this, let me throw another cog into the thematic cubes. And I kind of mentioned this before. We just did the Brothers War, and I have an artifact cube. So you can imagine what that did to me. Or when I have a horror cube and we go to...
I have Eldring coming up.
How about you? Well, that's what I was about to say. We're going to go to Eldron, and we're going to go back to Morrowind. Imagine how that could actually debase or just break the foundation of your cube if you didn't curate responsibly. If you made brash... Basically, I'm saying if you added too much, you could basically throw
100%.
Although that excitement level is going to be there, right? I mean, there's going to be more food, and you wanted to do a food deck, right? But what method are you going to use? You know they're coming, right?
It's coming.
Mine's passed. We just went through Midnight Hunt with me, and we just went through Brothers War, etc. And we're going to go to Phyrexia again, which is probably going to get me some more. As we start moving over to yours, your curation testing is about to happen. Your responsible.
So I'm actually going to be a little bit of a shill for the cube community, just as a whole. And what I want to say is that if you're a curator, you should participate in the surveys that Lucky Paper Radio puts out. Just saying.
I would agree with that.
Because when you do the surveys of cards that you're speculating about, cards that you're kind of looking at and kind of considering throwing them in and being like, okay, I can look at the list and be like, here is kind of the cards that I'm interested in throwing in. Here's some of the things that might just fit in this environment. So, for example, I did it with Dominaria United. And I ended up throwing in things like Phoenix Chick and whatnot, but I didn't immediately throw it in. I sat on those cards, I put in the survey, and I reflected on them. I, put them on my maybe list. I kept looking at my colors that I wanted to put them in, so say, Phoenix Chick and whatnot, and I kept asking myself, honestly, does this provide anything to the things that I'm already doing? And then ultimately, after Dominaria and the survey ended up passing, by the time you couldn't answer it anymore. And after Dominaria United has been out for a week, I've kind of sat and digested those thoughts and digested that maybe board and been like, okay, I've now thought about it. I've ended up with a Phoenix Chick by proxy. And I've kind of decided, that's something my cube wants to do. I already have things like Magma Phoenix. I already just need more aggressive one-drops. Even though the subtypes don't match anything, it doesn't matter because it's just a good card.
Exactly, on it.
And that's my biggest advice.
So you're not having an emotional, right? And that is the advice, so that you don't so you don't get that overinflated tire or a flat tire. That's the best analogy I can offer today. You don't want to overtip the scales by making too many drastic.
Resist.
Although the new squeaky thing has come out. Resist.
Make notes. Digest it.
Slow down. Don't listen to May, not Anthony.
You want to take your ice cream cone and you want to lick it. Then you want to savor it. And let it just salivate in your mouth for a minute. And then you want to take a bite of the ice cream cone after you're sure you like it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the feedback. I've got some specific scenarios, and then how the decisions were made. So when we went to CubeCon, people played my Uber Bears Artifact Cube, as I've said 100 times at this point. And another card that was a significant outlier was Kappa Cannoneer. And for 5 colorless and 1 blue,
cool
Artifact Creature, Turtle Warrior, 4/4, Improvise, which is a whole bunch of fancy stuff where you can tap and reduce the cost by tapping.
I love Fake
artifacts.
Affinity.
And it has Ward 4. And whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, and it can't be blocked this turn. Well, what I missed with this whole thing is when it enters the battlefield, it automatically gets a 1/1 counter on it. So it becomes a 5/5 out the gate, Ward 4, and it got reduced cost on it, so people were casting it extremely fast.
And it's hard to remove.
Meanwhile, I'm over here. And as a curator sitting across the table having this happen to me, I had to make believe I knew this was going to happen. It was horrible. It didn't even take feedback. I got beat to death by this card repeatedly.
The feedback was you. You were.
The feedback was me. I didn't need anything else. I'm sitting there going, oh man, I'm thinking to myself, and this one person's like, I crushed the Uber Bear Cube, and I'm thinking, yeah, you did, but I'm pretty sure Uber Bear crushed himself because I put Kappa Cannoneer in my cube and got beat to death with it.
You're not sitting in traffic. Level. You are traffic.
I was literally a speed bump, and it was awful, but it was worth it. So then, I came back home. I licked my wounds, and I feel better now. And they released the
Sure.
Brothers War, and I kind of like some of the pieces of Kappa. Not all of them, especially the Ward 4, which basically turns your path to exile into costing 5 to even
Right.
deal with this thing. It's awfulness. I went ahead and went with Surge Engine. And for 2 colors, you get an artifact creature construct. It's a 3/2 with Defender. Pay 1 island, Surge Engine loses Defender and gains this creature can't be blocked. Or you can pay 2 and 1 island, Surge Engine becomes blue and has the base power and toughness 5/4. Activate only if Surge Engine doesn't have Defender. And then for 4 and 2 blue, you can draw 3 cards, activate only if Surge Engine is blue and only once. That's a lot of text.
It's a lot of text.
It kind of met a couple of things. So it met the flavor almost if you put the pictures side by side. One's a turtle and one's, I don't know, a beach spider thing. But they're kind of the same contextually as far as the storytelling. One's the Surge Engine is actually a construct. So it in fact actually falls into my archetypes better than, or my factions within my subgroups. I have a construct sub-theme, so it kind of made more sense. And it was also a mana sink, and it was also a fair magic card. And it took me actually seeing that card in action, Kappa Cannoneer, getting beat to death, and then getting later stories of people that got beat to death to find out that it was you got to learn, right? It was a poor decision. I consider myself a mature curator, but I totally overlooked the power of Kappa Cannoneer. The first group that I talked about, the Kappa scenario, that was more of a live event that showcased the problem with the card, and I was able to take action when I got home after receiving a large volume of feedback. Okay, now we're going to move over to my horror cube environment. And this is a second subject. And this is one that's been established over a long period of time, that the werewolves weren't as powerful as the other groups. So then I, as a curator, challenge accepted, began to overinflate, and it still hasn't gotten there if I'm being truthful, but I have overemphasized them too much, that maybe I'm throwing the scales off a little bit, where even in the case where I'm a huge proponent of symmetrical guilds, even if they're utilitarian or not, I really like to have it. It just looks pretty on paper for me, that I've started tilting it so that Gruul gets more backup. So I've added both the Arlen Planeswalkers, which is a little bit rich, but then I've made another, we're going to call this a quote-unquote, and I mentioned this during the Halloween special, a curation mistake. And I didn't realize that it was a mistake, and perhaps it's not, until I said it out loud and Stu caught it and ran with it in the episode. If you haven't heard this, listen to our Halloween special 2022. But we were discussing Rancor. And for 1 forest, you get an enchantment aura. Enchant creature gets +2/+0 and has trample. When Rancor is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return Rancor to its owner's hands. Well, I was so streamlined. So I had the horse blinders on, right?
Yep.
And I'm just trotting along, and I'm thinking, who wears Rancor? Only werewolves. And Christian just almost spit his beer out.
I don't know about that.
Because, that when Stu started reading this out loud to me, and I'm talking about, during it was literally during a podcast that we're doing, and I'm talking about how I've added Rancor for werewolves, and he's like, you do realize that anything can wear Rancor, right? And I'm like, yeah, and then I just immediately just clam up and say, well, I just want to write on there, only werewolves can wear Rancor. But my point is that I'm trying to counterbalance and help a group out that has shown weakness by, I guess I got belligerent at this point as a curator, right? And I put Rancor in there thinking that this is just completely, not realizing it's agnostic to whatever group or faction or subtype it goes on, but rather people are just going to immediately see this and go, humans don't really like Rancor. You know what likes them is
Rancor
wolves.
don't care. Rancor go wherever.
Yeah, Rancor don't. And this is a curation that's a curation mistake. And I have, it probably could have survived just fine, but it's not a pivot point or a point of repair to fix that flat tire that the werewolves have. All that was doing, and as Stu pointed out there in that episode, is making the potential that Simic could get a hold of it. Right? Or Selesnya. And it could be humans or a flyer. It doesn't matter. A spirit would wear that. A Bant spirits would gladly wear Rancor. And it would just continue to perpetuate the problem that I was trying to do countermeasures to help bolster up the werewolf faction.
Right.
And at the end of the day, not realizing it's completely agnostic and didn't care anyways. I'll call it sloppy curation on my part, and I'll just own it. How about that? What do you got to say about that, May?
If you're expecting me to beat you up more,
yeah.
I'm not going to.
Yeah. I'm just running the crucible at this point. Like, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. No, yeah, but I kind of learned from that, I guess. Which moves over to my third in progress lesson. And I have a La Femme Fatale cube that we've talked about on a previous episode that basically celebrates all the, I guess particularly the female gender in the Magic multiverse, just because it's cool, and I thought it was underrepresented, if that's fair. And so it didn't take me too long to realize that most of those cards that had that particular art style on them were actually very aggro oriented, like just fast, meaning like efficient cards. A lot of like female arts with they're humans, they're like 2/1s, and so right, and I started putting them in the box, and then I started realizing, oh man, they're just really fast, and I didn't have any mid range. So
just
one of the
doing
things I learned
stuff,
after multiple drafts. Yeah. After multiple drafts, like running Lelia the Blade Forge and all that, which I've since taken.
I mean, I also think that's on you because Lelia the Blade Forge is.
I made a mistake.
It's a strong card.
It was in my power cube. Why can't it go in my thematic
cube, right? Sometimes you just gotta bite the bullet and be like, all right, I added a big, dumb, powerful card. My bad.
Which I am. I'm running the Crucible right now. I'm literally putting myself... You guys just throw eggs at me as I run this course. But it took that feedback of just playing... And this is one of the examples. We're using this one on my changes and making course corrections. This one actually took multiple iterations of play to basically flush out that the aggro part of the archetypes that generally spoke to aggro were too strong. So as a curator, I started doing more of a slow, meticulous build up to mid-range to counterbalance it, not to beat it. And the way I did that was added a card like Sereth the Viper's Fang for 2 colorless and 2 forest. You get a legendary creature human warlock, a 3/4, and she reads as other tapped creatures you control have death touch, and other untapped creatures you get hexproof. And then for 1 colorless, you get to untap another target creature or land you control. And
so,
May, yes, go for
I
it.
am going to put you on blast here and ask, honestly, are you sure that you're not overcorrecting the problem after you already just removed Lelia?
I know I am. I'm 100% I am. Look what I did there. I literally put these 3 down so you could throw rocks at me or whatever you had close by, books. I don't care. But your
sequence of progression
the best
here
way for people to learn is through mistakes. Yes,
your sequence of progression was, wow, I want to throw in all these fun aggro cards. Wow, Lelia is so cool. And then it's just like, wow, this was a dumb card. Not only did you cut Lelia and all these other aggro cards, but you also improved mid-range. So what ends up happening is that after you cut this big gaping hole out of aggro, now you just have this pillar of mid-range.
Pillar, big old giant walls that are big green do-nothings.
Yep.
Yes. And this is the point of this episode, is to show the causality of these decisions, right? It's tipping the scales, and you're never going to get it right. And the reason why I put these 3 absurd examples out there is so that everybody could see that I, Anthony... I'm constantly running the Crucible, right? And May's just one of many that have looked at this and go, why are you running it? Whatever compelled you to think that would be okay? And you know what? But then, as you noticed in her observations or her constructive criticism, she gave a reason, and then she explained to you that I'm making a hole here, and I'm basically digging sand, making a hill over here, and then realizing I have a hole that I have to fill out, so I have to move more sand. I mean, it's just the way. It's a never-ending battle as a curator. Would we agree? Yep. And so I got a few final questions that I think we cover before we start moving out. May, how often do you update your cubes, just generically speaking?
Well, I can actually tell you how often I update my cube, and I have managed to cut down my cube updates to around twice a month. However, I used to be updating multiple times a month, around once a week. Because I used to be not only getting more data online during earlier versions of the cube, but also I was playing online with my girlfriends and whatnot, which was giving me immediate feedback, which I was, also leaning into. But over time, I have gotten better about, I have almost 90 followers on my fake cube. They need to hold me accountable and keep me honest that I can't just make changes without reason anymore. I'm not just going to throw things in willy-nilly just to test out the waters anymore. Now I have to have now I have to write out my reasons of, okay, I'm throwing this in. I'm aware it might be a problem, but I'm just gonna test the waters. And then after I started testing the waters, I was like, okay, I was wrong. I'm just gonna undo that and pretend I didn't do it.
I would say that within our particular, our group, our circle, Chris and Christian and Stu and this huge consortium of individuals we have, most of us have cubes. And we do give on the fly immediate context to, hey, I think this card, but it's normally like post game. And it's kind of become part of our system, but it's more thought out. Like I observed that maybe your reanimator package might be a little strong in here. I think we should keep an eye on it. Or Stu will say that I think you've got Avenger Zendikar and such cube, and I think maybe you should put a pin in it. I think it might be a little too threatening in this environment. Let's give it a few more goes. It's just a way of processing that. And I think if you can get your group to agree to that kind of social contract of talking it out and then kind of everybody being vigilant, because it's everybody's game, right? It's a community-based game. And so that'll also calm down your curators from making just insane overcorrections, right? We're steering and counter-steering all the time too much. But if we can get everybody to work together as a collectively on the cube development and curation, it'll run a lot smoother and it'll kind of tailor to everything. Then we can identify what all these spikes want and the Timmies, et cetera, right? And the power players, and everybody can kind of get a little voice in that, and it'll help refine the cube environment. So closing thoughts, consider multiple games. If an archetype or a faction or a subtype continues to fail or be outclassed, then you can make decisions, but make them, we would say, wisely based on data, right? Don't just do it haphazardly. It's just my personal advice. Overcorrection does happen in a cube. I update every new set or wait for cube feedback from community, research, papers like White Wolf has great papers. Lucky Paper Radio has great set reviews, et cetera, right? You can get a lot of advice from your cube community before you make decisions to add cards in, because it may not be in complete context to the environment you're supporting, but it does have value. Another recommendation that I have is keep a journal of card performance. And that's just kind of a mental note. Put a pin in it, right? Like anytime somebody says, hey, I think this card's a little bit too strong or whatever, just annotate who said it, take it into context, and find out, if that makes sense. And then you as a curator, and we talked about this before, is how to process the suggestions from outside. A lot of times the players may have limited context if it's the first time sitting down. So maybe it's a good idea that you brief them, or at least you help them to understand the kind of environment they're walking in, so you can kind of crowd control a little bit, if you will, right? So you're not getting a complete riot on your hands, like, why are you not running Storm? I saw, Yawgmoth's Will. It puts it into context quickly. The updating ideas that we threw out there, I suggested order extra cards and then trickle them in over mass. May suggested putting them into your maybe board, correct? And then kind of migrating them over after you had a chance to ruminate.
And think digest it. Just put a pin on it, put it in your maybe board, and then just really digest it, really look at your colors. Give yourself play sessions before adding cards that you're considering to think about if this actually improves the experience.
And then how to basically use the feedback that you're receiving and listening to your players, because as May had suggested, that you're trying to hit that target of fun.
Follow the fun.
But you don't get to just project fun. Everybody's got to find it together. So in order to get that, you need to work together as a collective, and everybody needs to give you good feedback and explain to you what their logic is for their criticisms, good, bad, and all the above, right? Example that we have with my buddy Chris, and we've talked about it over a long period of time, and I've mentioned this multiple times, was about using pestilence in his pauper environment, and that it was really strong in his pauper environment. But then he had the emotional attachment. I think it was a beta or whatever. It was really, really old and had a lot of value and worth to him. And so that emotional attachment, but at the end of the day, the card was actually a little bit of a detriment to his environment. So we discussed it, right? Because it's kind of like that. It was his squeaky toy, and we didn't want to make fun of it. And then discuss, like we talked about, limiting your cuts, or try not to over tinker. Use a method. Feedback, play testing, community information, podcasts, content creators, articles, ChillMTG, etc. We have a Discord channel you can come into where we openly talk about this. Well, I put a card out today, and they immediately started giving me feedback on it, right? And then I'll leave you with this, that old adage, if it isn't broke, don't fix it.
No need to break it more. No need to make the mid-range green pillar when you cut your aggro cards, huh? Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, everybody learned something today.
Throwing my tomatoes while I can.
May, I want to tell you
Of course.
thank you. As always, it's truly appreciated. It is always a pleasure having you on the show, and we will do this again and again because I can't not. Because it's so much fun talking with you.
I love talking about it.
And yeah, I do too. We're both passionate about this particular game and curation of it. And would you mind telling people how they might find you and how they might reach you on the social media?
Well, you can find me at Myagic1 at Twitter. It's so long as it still exists. Cough. You can also find me. You can find me, yes, Myagic, Myagic, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitch, and on Tumblr now. So I have alternatives.
And in UberCube Discord.
No, I'm not throwing in my Discord. I'm not doing that.
No, you can join my Discord.
Yes, I am in your Discord.
You can come in
that
ours.
is true.
May is hanging out
that
there
is true.
with us.
I'm definitely there.
Other than that, if you love the show, and we certainly hope you do, because this was just a fantastic thing to talk about. I love cube curation. We would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. You can also find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod. And you can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com, or you can link us on our Discord at UberCube or #UberCube, where you can talk to May and find out all these awesome things we're talking about in that Discord. You can also find us. We have a Patreon. It's UberCube landing site. And other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Where'd you go, May? Let's do this again. You just wanted to see me do this all on myself. All right, here we go. One more time. All right, she was totally trolling me. All right, and then other than that, we're gonna say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is happy cubing. May, are you killing me on purpose?
Sorry.
You did it twice. All right, one more time.
All right, third time's the charm.
All right, one more time. Third time I'm a horse. All right. Other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always do here at UberCube.
Happy cubing.
Happy cubing.
She's a horse.